We're going to be covering in the 12th book of Yisrayl, He Who Rules as Yahweh. We're going to be covering part 2 of the 12th book of Israel and chapter 11 this evening. Chapter 11, the title of this evening's sermon that Pastor gave on September 22nd of 2012, the title is, Satan is out to persecute and deceive. She knows nothing but lies. She knows nothing but lies, and she teaches lies to all the world. And that's part of what we can see, the results of those lies in the very news that's going on that we see today. This past week, there's dramatic escalation in the situation in Ukraine with the shooting down of that Malaysia passenger jet where 298 people were killed, and also the escalation in the Gaza Strip area or Gaza. And so we can see that the hatred is building, the destruction is building. Scott Pelley on the national news this evening, he said there are 41 wars in the world today. And he cited several examples where he said, for example, he cited 2 examples. One was the shooting down of the Malaysian jetliner with 298 people aboard and all killed. And he also pointed to the situation in Gaza, specifically where these 4 young boys were playing on the beach, and they were hit and killed by Israeli rockets that exploded on the beach in Gaza. And he said man's reach, and he said we can see the result of man's reach, and he compared that to man's vision. You know, man can reach out to 30,000 feet, and mankind can reach out with their modern weaponry. They can reach out into the heavens, 30,000 feet, and destroy an airliner out of the sky just by pushing a button. It's the same thing with shooting rockets and missiles and bombs on the beach in Gaza and killing not only four boys but other victims. So we can see the reach that mankind has, but only here at the House of Yahweh do we see Yahweh's vision and given to Yahweh's witness, Yisrayl Abel Hawkins, and so we see Yahweh's vision. The world today, they're great at demonstrating man's reach, but they don't have, but their vision is very limited. Their vision is based on the lies that Satan is teaching them at this time. So, with that backdrop, the news and the prophetic events that are going on, I'd like to begin reading on page 79 of this chapter. And there's some main points we'd like to cover here. The first one is the word submission, to submit, and also the word subjection. The world makes these words evil. They want to make them sound evil. The word submission. And another point I'd like to cover here this evening is, in the first part, is that rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft. Rebellion is when we don't submit. That's as witchcraft to Yahweh. And the third point in this first part of the class this evening, in verse 24, it says, pastor says, submission is actually the keys to the kingdom of Yahweh. That's the number one thing to get into the kingdom, he says. So we'd like to cover those points here this evening. So I'd like to begin on page 79, the first part of this sermon here. He opens up with the statement, the wickedness of the Catholic Church is not letting up. And so he opens up with that statement, but leaves it alone at the beginning here and goes on with it later. But then he talks about jobs in the house of Yahweh. Apparently, when this Sabbath sermon was given, he says here, you can't leave your job to go to another one until that job is done. If you're washing dishes, get the dishes washed, and then go to another job if you want to do another job. So he's making the point here. We need to stick to our jobs, stick to the things we've been assigned by Yahweh to do, and do them with all our might. And then he moves on here in verse 5. He says, Satan speaks at all times to those who will listen. And I'd like to read in James, the book of Jacob 4, verse 7. Therefore, submit yourselves to Yahweh, resist the devil, and she will flee from you. Satan speaks at all times to those who will listen. If we don't listen to the adversary, she's going to move on. She's not going to waste her time with those who will not listen to her lies. And that's what Jacob 4, verse 7 is saying. Therefore, submit yourselves to Yahweh, resist the adversary, resist the devil, resist Satan, and she will flee from you. She's not going to hang around where her time is being wasted. So resist the adversary, and she's gonna move on. In verse 6 here, Pastor talks about going back to this word submission here. But if you would turn over to 1 Samuel, it seems like someone is wanting to make the word submission or submit, and also the word subjection, to make these evil words, they want to make them sound evil. Well, Satan is great at this. She can take something that is so wonderful and make it sound evil, such as servitude. The world can make that sound very evil, but it's very wonderful. What could be more wonderful than a child submitting to the parent's authority? What could be more wonderful than for a child to obey their parents? Now that's submission. That's an example of submission. That situation, a child submitting to the authority of the parents, brings peace in that household. It brings joy to the child because there's order and peace with the parents. In verse 7 here, what could be more wonderful than the whole world turn and repent and submit to Yahweh's laws of righteousness? We wouldn't be dealing with 41 wars in the world today, 41 active wars, if the world would be practicing Yahweh's laws of righteousness. It couldn't get better than practicing Yahweh's laws. In fact, it's going to be that way one day, and those who won't submit, of course, won't be in this renewed world, in the kingdom that Yahweh has planned for mankind. They just simply won't be there. So these traits of submission, subjection to authority, that's what we must come to understand and practice in order to be in Yahweh's kingdom. Imagine all of this hell-raising that's going on right now. Imagine that in the kingdom. But that's what these stupid jerks want that follow Satan, who is a liar. And I notice, Pastor says, sometimes when people are given the opportunity, like the Israelites, as the Apostle Kepha was talking about, they left the laws of Yahweh, left the righteous teachings of the priest. They left it, and like a dog that returned back to their own vomit. Their memory is lost, and the only thing they can do is lie. In the last part of this first page here, and so she wants to make the world submit sound evil. Let's turn over to page 80 if you're following along in your books. Anyway, here we see how important it is in the time of Samuel, who was a very righteous priest. he stood up for Yahweh's laws, he will have his place in the kingdom. Yahweh shows that even by Yeshua, he was guiding. He was one of the righteous guides of Israel who was persecuted by those who hated Yahweh's laws. So we see the persecution. We see what they did to our great high priest Yeshua. Yes, it was all prophesied. But you can read the book of Yachanan from beginning to end, and you'll see how their interest in Yeshua ended up in their total hatred for Yeshua, and they weren't satisfied until they killed him. But they turned against Samuel in 1 Samuel 7 and 8 and turned to Christianity. They wanted a king to rule over them. They didn't want the priests of Yahweh to rule over them. And then it wasn't long after that they turned back to Satan again because of money. They wanted money. When Satan sued Yahweh for divorce, when Satan sued Yahweh, her husband, for divorce, she wanted money. She wanted land, and of course, he gave it to her. That was a bargain, you know. I mean, she sold out cheap, but she sold out. And that's the thing. She sold what she could have had forever. She sold out. The prodigal son, the so-called prodigal son, is a similar example to that, selling out cheap. If you look at Luke 15, verse 11, we see that the certain man had 2 sons, and the younger one said to his father, "Give me my portion of property, which is coming to me." So he divided the inheritance between them. So he divided, the father divided the inheritance between the 2 sons, and he gave the younger one, who was asking for his inheritance, he gave it to him. And then, so the young man left his father's household, went out to a foreign land where it says he lived riotously, and riotous living, sinful living, and to the point where he squandered all his inheritance. He spent all his money, and he had nothing left of it. He put his money in a bag with holes, and to the point where he was left to feed the swine so that he had some corn husk to put in his mouth to chew on. And he says, so then he says, "Well, why don't I go back to my dad's place? At least his servants have plenty to eat." And then he said to his dad, "I am not worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants." And this is a key. This is actually what he came back as, a hired servant. No longer a son with the inheritance that he had right to initially. But the father said to the servants, "Bring out the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and sandals on his feet." Okay, so now he's got a robe and a ring and sandals. Then bring out the fattened calf here and kill it, and let him eat and be merry. Let us eat and be joyful. Okay, so now he's got something to eat too. But so when the older son, when he saw this, he was distressed, and he said to his dad. Now the older son was, the oldest son wasn't understanding what was going on here, and but the father explained to him. Then he said to him, "Son, you are always with me, and all that I have is yours." And that's the key. That's the inheritance. This son still had his inheritance. He had everything. He had a right to everything, And this is the key here. We have an inheritance with Yahweh, and continuing in the house of Yahweh, continuing in on to perfection, coming in, as Genesis 1 verse 26 says, Yahweh wants us to give us the inheritance He has promised. The son who returned, he no longer had the right to say, "Well, Dad, I want you to divide your property again and give me an inheritance again." No, it was gone. What he had was food and clothing, and that was it. So maybe a position in the kingdom, but not the great position that it says in Daniel 7:24 Then the kingdoms and governments and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven will be given to the people of the saints of Yahweh, whose kingdom is an everlasting kingdom. So that's the inheritance. So continuing on here in the sermon, Pastor's talking about Samuel and what he said to King Saul. King Saul had disobeyed Samuel. He was only and Pastor's a little tongue-in-cheek here. He says he was only a priest of Yahweh. Samuel was only a priest of Yahweh. That didn't amount to that didn't spell anything. Didn't spell squat to King Saul. Samuel was just a lowly priest of Yahweh. Look at his shoes. He's got holes in his shoes, and he says that man wants to spend all his money on the house of Yahweh. Wants to take all of our money and spend it on the house of Yahweh. So, I mean, we can see how dedicated Pastor is in pushing forth the work and his great concern for us in these last days and in bringing us to perfection. Then Samuel said, this is verse 22 of 1 Samuel 15. Then Samuel said, "Has Yahweh as great a delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of Yahweh?" The answer he gave Saul was, Behold, to obey, to submit, to be in subjection to, behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to listen better than the fat of rams. So it's not sacrifice Yahweh wants, it's obedience. Because in verse 23 of 1 Samuel chapter 15, because rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft. And Pastor goes on and he says, rebellion, now get this, rebellion is when you don't submit. Rebellion is when a child doesn't submit to her parents. Rebellion is when a priest does not submit to Yahweh. Rebellion is when a wife does not submit to her head. If she didn't submit to, and then he gives an example of a woman employed by an employer. And he says, if she didn't submit to her boss, it would be a different thing. He'd simply fire her and find someone who would submit. You know why? Because the boss doesn't want her to ruin his business. Rebellion ruins the business. Yahweh's business, a worldly business. Do it your way? Yeah, you can do it your way, but go somewhere else and do it, the boss would tell this woman. You're not going to do it in my business. That's what the boss would tell her, so they would gladly submit to their boss's instructions. Okay, and so if they're doing it for money, we should submit out of a pure heart. Should come from our heart. Well, this is what the world is today. And, and Pastor is using these examples. He's using these examples here of a woman submitting to her employer. Why wouldn't she also submit to her husband, for example? And he's also talking about modern society and the divorce rate. And he doesn't use those words, but and I've got a note here. This is a description of modern Western society promoted by the Pope. Okay, by the Catholic Church. They encourage the women to be to not be in subjection. But anyway, moving on to verse 15 here. Well, this is what the world is today. The Catholic Church, who is raping all these children here that you saw last night on the video, or last on the video, they're the ones that are egging this on, encouraging it, promoting it. That and their governmental agencies that have full control of who they got set up to take children away from you, and they say your children don't belong to you. They belong to the government, so that we can take them anytime we want to. These were the laws set up by the Nimrod system, and put truly in force under the Herodians. And then he gives us a little history lesson here about the Herodians taking over the army, enforcing it, using the army to enforce their laws, starting about 43 of this common era. And just a few years before they destroyed the temple, which was around 70 of this common era, and they uprooted the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes and took them to Rome. Well, that's iniquity. Notice, that's iniquity. If you read the top line there, witchcraft and stubbornness is the same as iniquity. They're doing away with the laws. And that's what the Catholic Church is all about, from the food laws to right on down the line, keeping of the Sabbath. They have pushed the laws of Yahweh to the side. They promote Satan's lies, and what we see in the world today is 298 people being blown out of the sky and 41 wars. 41 wars active wars going on at this present time. Iniquity is doing away with the laws in Daniel 7:25 shows that the Catholic Church will do away with the laws. Change the laws. They eventually will do away with them totally and forbid anyone to practice it or even own a Bible. Daniel 7:25, well, Daniel 7 and verses 24 and 25, and the 10 horns out of this kingdom are 10 kings that will arise, and another will arise after them, and he will be different from the first ones, and he will subdue 3 kings. This is talking about the historical formation of the Catholic Church. And verse 25, and this one that will subdue 3 kings, he will speak great words against Yahweh and will wear out, mentally attack to cause to fall away. And she did this over the centuries to the point where the House of Yahweh could no longer be found after the time of Constantine. Wear out, cause to fall away the saints of Yahweh, and think to change times, Yahweh's feast days, the laws, and they will be given into his hand until a time and times and a dividing of times. But that time, times, and dividing of times is at hand. Is at hand. And what we see today in the news, we see the build-up to the nuclear wars. We see the hatred coming against Russia for her part in building these missiles that allowed mankind to reach out to 30,000 feet and bring this airliner down with no survivors. Let's go over to page 81 here. Actually, I'm just going to finish up on page 80. Pastor says, I want you to understand the fight that the saints have had to keep manuscripts alive so we could have the book of Yahweh. And Pastor documented this very well in the Prophetic Word magazine, the book of Yahweh. It's here and it's here to stay. So moving on here to verse 20. In 1 Samuel 15:33, and iniquity is God worship. Well, that's what God worship is. The gods started in Egypt, the pharaohs. They were made gods by these people. And the gods that they worshiped, the demons, the scripture shows, came and substitute for them. So they don't actually know that they're worshiping demons when they go to the graves to pray. No, the people they're praying to, at the grave sites they're praying, those people, as it says in Ecclesiastes, know nothing. They are asleep until the resurrection. And Pastor says, and when the great wars, the crusades took place, if you'll notice, it was to capture and recapture land that had graves of their gods on them, tombs, so they could go visit these places and find one of these gods that would answer their prayers. And of course, they never did. They're all asleep, seems like. It's almost like praying to a rock as they say about the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem. In verse 21, because you have rejected, and this is, if I could just take a moment and read that in 1 Samuel 15, verse 20. Then Shaul said to Samuel, therefore I have obeyed the voice of Yahweh. I went on a mission which Yahweh sent me on. Yes, he went on a mission. And I brought back Agag, king of Amalek, which he was supposed to do. I've utterly destroyed the Amalekites. Yes, he did. But not quite. But the people took the plunder. So now he's blaming the people. You know, individual responsibility. We're all responsible for our own actions. You know, when judgment comes, we're all responsible for ourselves. We're not going to point to someone else in our day of judgment. But the people took the plunder, sheep and oxen, and the best of the things which they should have destroyed, to sacrifice to Yahweh. And here's the justification, but there is none. Then Samuel said, has Yahweh as great a delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the instructions, the voice of Yahweh? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to listen better than the fat of rams. Because rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness is the same as iniquity and God worship. Because you, King Shaul, have rejected the word of Yahweh, Yahweh also has rejected you from being king and from having an inheritance in the kingdom of Yahweh. Then Shaul said to Samuel, now he goes into his repentance phase, but it was shallow and empty, because it wasn't the first time that he obeyed the voice of the priest who gave him instructions from Yahweh. So in verse 20, then in Pastor's sermon, then Shaul said to Samuel, now he admitted he had sinned. I have sinned because I have transgressed the commandment of Yahweh. Now he knew all of that. These were commandments of Yahweh, straight from Yahweh through the one sent, Samuel, but also who taught Samuel the laws of Yahweh to begin with. And Yahweh taught Satan the laws of Yahweh. Nothing was hidden from her. Yahweh taught Satan the laws of Yahweh, and she rebelled against them. Yes, she rebelled against them. And this is the third point we're coming to here in the sermon this evening. In Genesis 3, you know submission is actually the key to the kingdom of Yahweh. That's one of the pastor's main points in this sermon. That's the number one thing to get into the kingdom. And if you will submit, if you won't rebel, you will turn to righteousness. You will start to practice righteousness. In verse 26 here, Pastor goes into Genesis 3, verse 1. Now the serpent was more subtle, crafty than any beast of the field which Yahweh has made. He made her too. Yes, he did. Satan is a created being. If you remember, that's shown about the adversary in Isaiah, Yeketskia, in Isaiah 14, Yeketskia 28. So, going back to the title here, Satan is out to persecute and deceive. She knows nothing but lies. And the world events we see testify to what the witness is teaching us, that, Satan has nothing but lies to offer the world, and we see the results of it in the news that's going on as we're sitting here this evening. May Yahweh bless your understanding. If you'd all please stand. It's my honor and privilege to introduce the second teacher this evening, the great Kohan Levi Hawkins.
Shalom, everyone. Please be seated. So, continuing where the great Kohan left off in the sermon that we're reviewing here concerning the title again as Satan is out to persecute and deceive, she knows nothing but lies. But throughout this sermon, the one thing that Pastor stresses on is submission. submission, being subject to the laws of Yahweh, submitting to the authority that is over us in all instances, showing that this is, as the great Kohan just read, if we are able to do this, and when we do this, this is part of us becoming part of that kingdom, or the keys to the kingdom, as was read in verse 24. The number one thing that will get you into the kingdom is submission, submitting to the authority. But let's go down to verse 33, because you can see that in the world, in following Satan, and the example that Satan set it's an example of rebellion. And you would find that it's one of the things that we all have to fight against, that desire to rebel against authority, just as Satan has taught to mankind. But let's look at verse 33 here, because there's a point I want to cover. It says, well, here is Satan. And if you notice verse 5, the worship of Elohim, that is the gods. If you also notice, they knew they had sinned, even Adam in verse 7. They realized that they had sinned, and of course they left the face of Yahweh. They left the face of Yahweh, put on short shorts, high heels. That's not the face of Yahweh that I see in the scriptures. The face of Yahweh is told to wear modest apparel. Yes. And the wearing of modest apparel don't only apply to women, but it also applies to men. Men have to wear modest apparel in the house of Yahweh, and there is a standard that is set for everyone. But the key here again is submitting to the authority, submitting to the instructions, submitting to the rules. Pastor said, submit to your husband. Don't submit to every man that comes along, but submit to your husband. Let's go to verse 34. Well, if you go over to Kepha now, first Kepha, we see here that the righteousness is taught. And of course, this is what is taught in the last days. The same righteousness that was taught by Samuel, by all the prophets, you find here at the house of Yahweh. And Yahweh says, in the last days, I will establish my house by a righteous branch. I will raise up a righteous branch. He testifies that of me, yes. And I know you love Yahweh through me, and I'm going to teach you to love him even more. Now, think about that statement. How much would we know about Yahweh without pastor? And that's correct. Really nothing. You might know the word. But what would you know of Yahweh's character? The essence of him and his righteous laws without the one sent. We would know nothing. We would absolutely know nothing about Yahweh. As a matter of fact, we'll be just like the rest of Christianity, calling Yahweh Elohim, Yahweh Adonai, not thinking that it matters, his name matters, or anything matters. You can mix it with any other God that you want to, and it wouldn't make any difference. But he has taught us to love Yahweh. He has actually taught us to love the Creator and to love his laws. And as he said, he will continue to teach us to love him even more. So there's so much to know about Yahweh. There's so much to know about the laws of Yahweh. For instance, a few weeks ago, he was teaching us about the laws concerning those cities that have been set aside if someone is fleeing, if they have murdered someone and so forth, giving us the information on those laws and how those laws are applied, concerning those particular cities. But he teaches us to love Yahweh, to love the laws of Yahweh. Let's go on to verse 36, and here is in 1 Kepha chapter 3. Well, 1 Kepha chapter 2, and beginning with verse 1. He says, therefore laying aside all malice and guile, hypocrisy, envy, and all evil speaking. And these are instructions that we receive from the house of Yahweh. And we know what malice is, we know what guile is, we know what hypocrisy is, envy, evil speaking. All of these things has been taught to us by the one sent. If you remember the Going On to Perfection series, he expounded on these things, showing why we must have love for the brothers, love for one another, and why we need to put these things away from us. He taught us why it is so essential that we be able to control our tongues, not to speak evil, to control everything that we say, and also to control our thoughts. Let's go to verse 38, continuing in 1 Kepha chapter 2. He says in verse 4, coming to him as to a living stone, indeed rejected by men, rejected by Satan and all other followers, rejected by men, but chosen by Yahweh and precious. That's what you are, brethren. You're rejected, you're hated by the world, but you're chosen by Yahweh. And why are we chosen by Yahweh? Because we submit to Yahweh. We submit to Yahweh. We willingly submit to Yahweh. Now that's something that the world don't believe. They don't believe that we are here by choice. You know, somewhere in their mind, Satan has deceived them into thinking another lie that Satan has told, that the people in the house of Yahweh, they're not here of their own free will. They're under some kind of mind control, they're brainwashed, they're this, that, and the other. But they refuse to believe that each of us are here willingly, of our own free choice. There's nothing to stop anyone from leaving the house of Yahweh if they choose to. You know, there's many followers to testify to that fact. Because if they were forced to remain in the house of Yahweh, there wouldn't be a following. They wouldn't be on the outside saying all the negative things that they say about the house of Yahweh. So even that shows that anyone can come and go as they please, but the ones who remain in the house of Yahweh willingly do so, willingly submit themselves to Yahweh. So this is part of our blessing, and because of it we are rejected, we are hated by the world, but we are chosen by Yahweh. Verse 5, you also as living stones are being built up, if you will get rid of this from verse 1, laying aside, get rid of it, malice, guile, envy, hypocrisy, speaking lies, speaking threats. These are all things that we have been instructed over and over again that we need to get rid of, and it takes practice to practice the righteousness to get rid of these sins. Verse 40, you also as living stones are being built up into a spiritual house that is a lawful house to obey, to be a holy priesthood to Yahweh through Yahshua Messiah. Let's go down to verse 43. Children, submit yourself to your parents. Elders, priests, submit yourselves to the one sent, to Yahshua Messiah, the judge, the king. Husbands, also submit to your wives in teaching them the laws of Yahweh. Wives, submit to learning the laws of Yahweh from your husbands. So we see this word again, throughout the sermon, pastor is emphasizing on this word submit, and we'll get to it. I'd just like to go through a couple of the definitions of this word submit. But let's continue on into verse 45 here in the book of Yisrayl. And this is verse 8 and 2 in Kepha, 1 Kepha chapter 2. And a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense, they stumble being disobedient to the laws of Yahweh, to which also they were appointed. By Satan, of course, she appointed them to cause trouble for Yahweh's house. But notice, it is the disobedience that causes them to stumble. But you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation. Why? Because we submit to the one sent. We submit to the laws of Yahweh. We submit to Yahweh Himself. That's what really sets us apart. It's our obedience, not our disobedience. As the great priest read before me in 1 Samuel chapter 15, disobedience will cause anyone to lose everything that Yahweh has to offer. But submission will cause one to gain everything that Yahweh has to offer. But this is what sets us up as a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation. All of these things to Yahweh, the light of the world. Let's look at verse 49 in the book of Yisrayl. Therefore, submit. Here's that dirty word. They should have put a four-letter word in front of that, shouldn't they? Well, they did, and they're doing it now. Therefore, submit. Verse 50, therefore submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for Yahweh's sake, whether to the king as supreme. How many you think is praying for the king right now, the president? If you look at the world, I would say maybe 1%, or maybe not even that many. For so is the will of Yahweh, that with doing righteousness are these laws of submittance to Yahweh totally. Look at verse 52. Servants, be subject to your rulers. Now, when you see that word submit, you see the word subject, you could just write in there, be obedient. Because that's what it's telling us, to be obedient. To submit means to be obedient to the one that has given you the instructions, to the one that you ought to submit to. Now, this word submit, taken from dictionary.com, it means to give over or yield to the power or authority of another. Now, there's a lot of hatred that has been built towards this concept of yielding to the power or the authority of another. Everything that society teaches is to fight against power and authority. To fight against the police, to fight against this, to fight against that, to fight against all authority structures, not to submit willingly. And as a matter of fact, when you really look into the definition of the word submit, and you read the usage of it, usually it portrays that if you submit, it means that you're weak. It means that you don't have the ability to fight back. So the whole concept of submitting is usually used in a negative way, that you're a weak person when you submit. But if you rebel and you fight and you disobey, well, that's strength. But that goes against everything that Yahweh has taught us. To submit is actually strength. To rebel and to fight against authority, that is weakness. But that's what you see in the world. You see the opposite. So again, this is another lie that Satan has brought forward, that if you submit, that you're being weak. No. It takes strength to submit. It takes the character of Yahweh to submit. And it takes being a man to submit. That's what it really all boils down to in the full definition of what it really means to be a man of Yahweh. But again, so this word means to give over or yield to the power or authority of another, to yield oneself to the power or authority of another. So this is something that you do on your own will. You're yielding yourself. You're not being forced to do so, as the world have in their minds when they think of this word submit, because when they hear this word submit, they think that you're being forced to submit. But this is not Yahweh's way. Yahweh doesn't force us to submit to Him. He teaches us why we should submit to Him, and He shows us the benefits of submitting. And He encourages us to do so, but He doesn't force us to do it, and He's not going to force anyone to submit to Him at all. It's something that has to be done of our own free will, of our own choice. This word also means to defer to another's judgment, opinion, decision, etc. And that is not easy at all times. When we have it in our minds that we want to do what we want to do, to submit to someone else's judgment, decision, or even their opinion, might be a very difficult thing to do. But if that person has authority over you, then you should. Then you should. Because that is the way of Yahweh. If you go the other way, and remember that example of, and that's why Pastor started off the sermon with Samuel and Saul, because he showed that when you go the other way, it has consequences. Regardless of the best reason that you may have in your mind for disobeying, it still boils down to the sin of witchcraft. It doesn't really matter what it is. And that could cut their place out of the kingdom of Yahweh. So we could see that from the scriptures, there is no, you don't have an opportunity to disobey authority from a scriptural point of view, righteous authority that has been set in place by Yahweh. Continuing on this word submit, the origin of the word, it means to place oneself under the control of another. What a horrible thing in the world's mind. Now you're under somebody's control. Don't control me. Don't be a control freak. You're manipulating me. You're using me. These are Satan's words, really. And this is what we have to fight against in our own minds, that carnally minded teaching coming from Satan and the lies herself. But to submit means you willingly do so, to place yourself under the control of another. And it's not a bad thing. It's not a horrible thing. It's not a weak thing either, that you're doing so out of weakness because you have no other choice but to place yourself under somebody else's control. No. It's something that is done out of love, out of obedience, out of willingness, knowing that it's beneficial. The other side of it, if you don't do so, then you see what the great Kahan was talking about in going on in the world today. You see the wars and the fightings that are taking place. You see the suffering that is going on in the world today because of they refusing to submit to the laws of Yahweh, not wanting to place themselves under Yahweh's control. Well, when you don't place yourself under Yahweh's control, then you're under the control of Satan. And when you're under Satan's control, then you see the bloodshed that is taking place. Then you see the many tears that people are crying. Then you see the anger, the grief, the bodies that are blown apart and so forth. That's what you see when individuals, nations, peoples place themselves under the control of Satan. You don't see that with Yahweh's way. Now, this word yield, because that's part of the definition of the word submit. It says to give over or to yield to the power or the authority of another, to yield oneself to the power or authority of another. This word yield, and this is an example of it, it says if you yield to someone or something, you stop resisting them. So if you truly yield to Yahweh, then you stop resisting Yahweh. You're not fighting against Yahweh. If you yield to the laws of Yahweh, then you're not fighting against the laws of Yahweh. In other words, you're obedient. If you yield to the one sent, then you're obeying everything that the one sent has said or has instructed. You're not fighting against it. You're not resisting. And this is really the key. If you yield to someone or something, you stop resisting them. If you're still resisting, it means that you haven't yielded yourself. You still haven't submitted fully. And this is, we have to bring ourselves in line with what Pastor is teaching us here, what he's trying to get across. Let's go down to verse 54. Now, what glory is it if you receive a beating for doing wrong and you endure it? But if you suffer for doing righteousness, for keeping the laws, that's what we have done. We have suffered greatly and still suffer reproach from it. We suffer persecution from the world for submitting to Yahweh. Submitting to Yahweh. But ultimately, it comes down to submitting to the one sent, because he is Yahweh's representative. Just as the Pope, the people who follow the Pope is Satan's representative. It's God's representative. But we submit to Yahweh. We submit to the one whom Yahweh has sent, and we suffer reproaches for it. And of course, Satan has run ahead and told many, many, many evil lies about the one whom Yahweh has sent, and we do suffer the reproaches for it. Notice verse 55, for to this you were called. For this you were called to go through these trials, keeping the laws of Yahweh. Because for doing righteousness, Messiah also suffered for us. Remember, he was rejected by Satan. He was rejected by Satan's followers. Still is being rejected today, that you should follow his steps. And that's all that Pastor has taught us, is to follow the steps of Yeshua, to follow the laws of Yahweh. He has not taught us anything else. You could search his teachings from beginning to end. You're not going to find anything else but submission to the laws of Yahweh and submitting or following the example that Yeshua himself has set. Let's go down to verse 57. And this is verse 23. Who, when he was reviled, did not revile in return when he suffered. He did not threaten, but committed himself. Now, this could be a very difficult thing when evil things is being spoken to you, and you want to retaliate. You want to say something back. You want to give that cutting retort. Yeshua didn't do so. He didn't give in to that temptation. He was able to control his tongue. He committed himself. Notice here, this committed again, and here is Yahweh doing, Yeshua doing this. He committed himself. He submitted himself. He didn't fight against the teachings that he himself taught. Don't retaliate. Turn the other cheek. This is, love your enemies. Yeshua submitted to the laws of Yahweh fully. He didn't resist. He didn't resist Yahweh. He rejected, notice now, he rejected everything that wasn't of Yahweh and submitted to his head, Yahweh. And this is the same example that Pastor sets for us. He rejects everything that is not of Yahweh, and he submits to Yahweh. 1 Kepha 3 verse 1, so, wives, in the same way be submissive. That's your calling, using chaste conduct. Wives, in the same way be submissive. Submit, yes. Your reward may not be now in your present situation, but you will be rewarded in that situation if you do what you're told by the prophets and apostles. And this applies to all of us. In every situation that we're in, where we are under the authority of someone else, we have that responsibility to submit to the authority. And as Pastor said, your reward may not be right now in your present situation, but you will be rewarded. And this is exactly what is written in Hebrews, and we'll turn there very quickly. In Hebrews chapter 11, verse 6, Yahweh will reward our obedience to him in all situations, So in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 6, for without the faith it is impossible to please him, for he who comes to Yahweh must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him, those who diligently obey Yahweh, those who seek to submit to Yahweh, willingly submit themselves to Yahweh by choice, not a forced submission, not a submission because you don't see another way out, basically, but you submit willingly, knowing that there are benefits in doing so, and that it's the right thing to do. It's the right thing to submit to Yahweh, and also there's a reward that is going to come from Yahweh for it. Let's go down to verse 60. For after this manner in the former times, the holy women who trusted in Yahweh also adorned themselves, being in subjection. These two words here, submit and subject, it's the same Greek word in Strong's Concordance, and they basically carry the same meaning of obedience, to obey. So it's a matter of obedience. So you could see that the holy women of old, they trusted in Yahweh, and they submitted themselves to Yahweh. And yes, they're going to be in the kingdom. And it's the same thing. We have to trust in Yahweh, and we have to submit ourselves to Yahweh. But we have to get it into our minds that submission is not a negative thing. That's one of the lies that Satan has told and has really pushed hard on mankind, that when you submit, it's something that you're doing that is wrong. So what this causes, and you see it in the world today, and that's why they can't come to any kind of peaceful solution or peace agreement, is because no one wants to submit to the other. Because if you submit to the other, that's a sign of weakness. Well, how are you going to come to an agreement? How are you going to walk in with unity if somebody don't submit to the other? How are you going to agree on anything if somebody don't submit? Someone has to give in. Someone has to yield. Just think about it. If both are coming to a stop sign and both parties decide not to yield, what are you going to have? You're going to have a collision. And that's what the world is heading for. It's heading for that collision. Well, it's a nuclear collision that the world is heading for, because no one is going to yield to the other. No one is going to submit to the other. But that is the teaching of Satan, that not wanting to submit, not wanting to be obedient, because it's perceived as being weak if you obey, as being weak if you submit to the authority, or submit yourself one to another. So this is what Pastor is covering here in verse 60. Let's go down to verse 64. Finally, all of you be of one mind, having compassion for one another, full of brotherly love, sympathetic and courteous, again instructing us how we ought to treat one another in the house of Yahweh. You know, you could just bracket that and just put the word respect, because that's what it's describing right there in that sentence. Not repaying evil for evil, nor reviling with reviling, but on the contrary, blessing, knowing that you were called to this, so that you may inherit the blessings, so that you may prove that you can submit and not turn in Satan's way to retaliation and murder and so forth. You proved yourself to Yahweh. It doesn't matter what the other person is doing. It doesn't matter what they're saying. It doesn't matter how many of the buttons they're pushing. It doesn't matter how hard they're stepping on your toes. The fact, what really matters is that you are proving yourself to Yahweh. That's what really matters at the end of the day. That's what really counts, that you are proving yourself to Yahweh. And that's the reason why you're doing it. Verse 68, for the eyes of Yahweh are on the righteous, and his ears are open to their prayers. But the face of Yahweh is against those who do evil, who will not submit. Who will not submit? The ones who resist, the ones who fight against the authority. If you look over to 1 Corinthians, this is shown throughout the Holy Scriptures from beginning to end. There simply won't be any rebellion in the kingdom of Yahweh. No rebellion allowed. Now, really think about this. There simply won't be any rebellion in the kingdom of Yahweh. Now, think of everything that pastors covered about children submitting to their parents, obeying their parents, wives obeying their husbands, husbands obeying the priest, and so forth, obeying the authorities, being subject to whatever authority that there is. And then put that all in, that there's not going to be any kind of disobedience in the kingdom. None whatsoever, in any way. We have found the perfect way of life in the laws of Yahweh, and everyone should know that by now. The perfect way of life in the laws of Yahweh, and it is. Again, all you have to do is just look at what the way the world is going, and you could see that that way of life is not bringing peace. You know, you could see what the world is doing, you could see what they're seeking after, and you could see, you know, we could see with our own eyes that way of life is not bringing peace. You know, being servants to one another here at the house of Yahweh, the biggest joy that I see is when that is going on and people serving one another, taking care of one another, putting others ahead of themselves, and so forth. You know, brothers, there's no way any of us could go wrong when we put someone ahead of us. When we put others ahead of us, it's a perfectly peaceful solution to put others ahead, to submit to one another. Let's go down to verse 77. And this is in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 26, but going on to verse 20 says, but you have not learned, or this is Ephesians actually, but you have not learned this from the Messiah, speaking of the rebellion and the disobedience. You didn't learn this kind of stuff from him, if indeed you have really heard him and have been taught by him. For the truth in Yeshua is this, that you put off concerning your former conduct the old man or the old woman, that way of disobedience, that way of resistance, that way of rebellion against Yahweh. These are the things which we have to put off, which is corrupt. Was corrupt all of your life before you were called into the house of Yahweh and started overcoming. Christianity has nothing to overcome. They just yield themselves to whatever their lust leads them to do. Their teacher is Satan, and whatever she wants them to do, that is what they will do, and that's why you see the wars and fighting, because that's what it ultimately leads to. If you don't submit to Yahweh, yes, you are going to have the wars, the fightings, the rivalries, the jealousies, the evil speaking, the gossip, the backbiting, everything that we are told not to practice. Notice verse 80, the old man, so it says, put off concerning your former conduct the old man which is corrupt according to the deceitful lust. To not do this, you have to submit to Yahweh's laws. You have to go to his house, You have to learn at the feet of the priest, and then you start practicing those laws. And this is what we have to do. We have to practice those laws. And that's why we are here. We came to the house of Yahweh to learn to submit and to become servants to one another. That's putting off the old man or the old woman, setting yourself up, learning to be a servant of Yahweh, a priest. Because that's what a priest is. A priest is a servant. That's the definition of a priest. A priest is a servant of Yahweh, a priest, a holy priesthood, loyal, that Yahweh can trust in any command that he gives, in any command, that you don't lean on your own understanding, that you don't try to change the instruction to do what you want to do instead of what you have been told to do. So he says, can trust in any command that he gives. Yes, you got to submit totally. Yahweh says, completely. It's a total submission that is required in order for us to enter Yahweh's kingdom. Then Pastor says, I am and I will throughout all eternity. That's my goal, to submit totally. That's the reason I serve you at this time. So Pastor is not doing it by force. He is willingly submitting himself to Yahweh's will, to Yahweh's instruction, and he's doing everything within his ability to serve Yahweh and to serve us by willingly submitting to Yahweh. So may Yahweh bless the understanding. We'll stop at this point here. And keep these things in mind, keep these lessons in mind on submission. So may Yahweh bless everyone.